reliability of how often.
That's the learning part, but do you consciously deliberate on it, or is it
We
automatic
can.
on which, or is it either for action selection?
There's 4 different kinds of action selection that are supported. One of them is a volitional kind of process where that's where William James's ideomotor theory would come into it. But there's also some that, like alarms, for example, don't even require any conscious interaction at all to get the behavior to be selected. It's slam your foot down on the brake. That bypasses consciousness. Okay, so once we have a selected behavior, that goes over to the sensory motor system. Now, one thing that I want to make sure everyone understands is, why do we need the sensory motor system to begin with? Why can't we just directly execute that behavior that we just passed through action selection? Well, it comes down to the granularity of how this behavior is usually specified. So the schemes that are coming from procedural memory are usually a higher level directive of pick up the cup, or maybe say some particular word, or whatever it might be. It's not directly executable by the actuators that the agent has. You have to somehow decompose pick up the cup into a series of low-level actions that need to happen to actually happen, or to actually achieve your goal. And so that's where action execution, the sensory motor system, come in place, breaking down a higher level action into these component executable smaller motor commands. So just to quickly go through this, so the sensory motor system has these long-term representations, which are motor plan templates. The details of this, don't worry about it too much, but realize that it contains within it motor commands that can be selected. So the motor command template, once one of these is selected based upon its relevance to the selected behavior, it will instantiate a concrete motor plan. This concrete motor plan, our implementation is based upon Roddy Brooks's subsumption architecture. But for everybody that's not familiar with that, it's a reactive kind of structure. It doesn't have any memory of what's gone in the past. It reacts to what the current situation is that the agent is encountering. And based upon that, it chooses the appropriate motor command. So just to make this a little clear, so we have the environment. So let's say we've already instantiated our motor plan based upon our action of what's getting our 7-layer burrito. So from the environment, so maybe you've got some incoming stimulus that where the person at the drive-thru is saying, okay, let me take your order, and all this stuff is picked up. There's a direct inner loop almost that goes from the environment sensory memory over to the sensory motor system, which then then executes things on the environment. So based upon these modality-specific representations, a particular set of motor commands are selected, or sent over to the actuators, which then actually executes that motor plan, updates the environment, which then affects what the agent senses in this next time step. And this inner loop continues until the goal is achieved, or maybe there's another action that has to subvert this one, another high-level action that has to subvert this one. And this process here, we call it online control because the motor commands themselves, they take feedback from the environment, and you might have to update the values that are actually going to the actuators based upon what's needed. Okay, so this is the last phase that we've talked about, the action and learning phase of LIDA. So conscious broadcast, we talked about coming into procedural memory. Procedural memory will then instantiate a set of behaviors based upon comparing the conscious broadcast to what's encoded in those schemes. Those instantiate behaviors or candidate behaviors go to action selection. A single one of those is selected, sent over to the sensory motor system, which then will choose a motor plan. And then you have this process of executing the motor plan right here in this sort of inner loop of online control. Woo, okay, so now we're at the learning mechanisms portion of the presentation. So, first off, we're going to just explain what we mean by learning in LIDA. Next, we're going to go over some of our conceptual commitments, specifically the ones that are relevant for learning. And then we're going to do a tour of some of our specific learning mechanisms related to perceptual learning, declarative learning, intentional learning, and procedural learning. So learning in LIDA, we conceptualize learning into 2 different types. And we kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. Instructionalist learning is related to learning new structures, so learning new concept representations, learning new schemes, learning new episodes, those kinds of things. And then there's selectionist learning, which is related to updates on different parameters that are attached to these structures. So base level activation is one of the big ones that we're going to be talking about, and I'll explain this in more detail as we go along. Now, one question that pops up related to learning is, well, how much of it is learned, how much does the agent have to learn, and how much of it is innate? This is a difficult, long-term, we can't, specifically answer this in any kind of definitive way, but what we can say is this. There's some things that must be built into our agent. We have to have some kind of primitive motivations. We have to know what the agent values. We have to know these values so we can choose how the agent acts because it wants to obtain certain things. It goes to what it means to be an autonomous agent. You have to have motivations that are internal. Other things like low-level feature detectors might be built in. Primitive actions, you have to have some idea of what you can do, at least at a low level. I can move my arm or some muscle. These are options to try. Because unless you know kind of what you can try, you can't try things out and learn things about your interactions with the environment. You have to have some basic idea of primitive actions. There has to be some kind of primitive attentional mechanism. So in our case, we're talking about attention codelets. You have to have some basic attention codelets. Other ones can be learned as we go along, but something has to be built in that says, this is important enough to attend to. And learning mechanisms themselves, you have to have some learning mechanisms built in or else there's no way of actually learning. Everything else in theory could be learned. There's just a gray area of how much you actually build in. There's, I think, one thing that I've heard a while ago, maybe it was in a class, maybe the control structures for autonomous agents class that I took from you, Stan, where if you already know everything, if your environment is completely deterministic and you know the optimal way of behaving in that environment, you can build everything, and there's no reason to have learning if you can specify everything at the beginning. So I think your environment itself might dictate how much you really want to learn. But in theory, anything can be learned other than some of these things. So the first commitment that we have, conceptual commitment we have, is to conscious learning. So the conscious learning hypothesis is this idea that all significant learning, and significant is an important word here, all significant learning requires consciousness. And this is also shared by global workspace theory as well. So the idea is that consciousness is both necessary and sufficient for learning. Now, I do want to make a distinction here about the processes themselves that are doing the updates, the actual learning mechanisms themselves. These things are unconscious. The agent is not conscious of the fact, oh, I'm learning now. It might have the intent of learning, it might be aware of that, but it doesn't know that, boom, learning just happened. So these learning processes, they're unconscious. Now, there are claims of unconscious learning, and two different varieties of this pop up a lot. One is in terms of priming, and the other is in terms of implicit learning. What we would say is that priming, the kinds of things that can be learned over priming, you're not going to necessarily learn how to drive a car or learn how to speak a foreign language or mathematics, these different things that we can learn through conscious learning. Priming is something that's usually shorter in duration, meaning it's not going to last you your entire life like a declarative memory might, and the kinds of things are limited. So that's what we mean by not significant learning. With implicit learning, what we're usually saying with this is that, well, actually, even though you might not be aware that you're learning, it still requires some kind of a conscious broadcast to initiate it. You have to have that conscious, the interaction between consciousness and the learning process to actually let this happen. And so, sleep learning, for example, there's a lot of evidence, against being able to learn much during sleep, but there's some evidence for some things being learnable. But then the question is, well, are you conscious during those parts of sleep? And it becomes a difficult thing. But in general, it's when we side on the side of thinking that consciousness is required for significant learning. Our second commitment, conceptual commitment, is called.
Can I ask about
Sure.
that?
Yeah.
Is that a kind of a working hypothesis? A strong working hypothesis?
I think
It's almost like, remember Anderson's no forgetting postulate? It's just, you want to make a strong claim and just see how far it can go.
Yeah. So drawing a line in the sand and saying, okay, well.
Yeah, because a lot of the evidence for like priming or implicit learning, we don't know if all the explanatory data that they think it's unconscious priming is just like one little conscious episode.
You don't have implicit learning when you're unconscious.
Right, okay, yeah,
That doesn't happen.
Yeah,
That's
right.
what's meant here.
yeah,
With the implicit learning.
yeah.
And we're not saying that priming, for example, isn't important. We want to model priming, but we're modeling priming in a way where it's not considered learning in LIDA. It's modeled in a different way, more of a temporary, adjustment to the structures that are there, the parameters, rather than something that would be a long-term thing.
Yeah,
But
I was
you're
just
right.
trying to make a point that a
No.
lot of people, when they show the data, oh, they're learning unconsciously. It could be, every once in a while, they have these conscious sort of events, and that can account for the whole data set.
Right?
Yeah,
Flashes of attention.
yeah, flashes of attention, yeah.
Okay, so the next conceptual commitment is profligacy in learning. And basically just the idea is that learning happens frequently and throughout all the different LIDA modules. The LIDA modules themselves learn independently, meaning that the conscious broadcast happens from the global workspace, goes out to all these different modules, and the modules do with that conscious content what they will. They'll select the content from the conscious broadcast that matter to that module, and they'll apply their module-specific learning processes to it. Learning can happen with every single conscious broadcast, and from a perceptual learning standpoint, attentional learning standpoint, procedural, sensory motor learning, that might happen with every single conscious broadcast. It's certainly possible, and the idea of profligacy is that we opportunistically do this as much as we possibly can. That doesn't mean that all the modules work with every conscious broadcast. We've talked about declarative memory, which requires a offline consolidation process. Okay, so next conceptual commitment, feelings are motivators and modulators of learning. Feelings have a specific meaning within LIDA. They are PAM nodes, perceptual associatory nodes, that have this attached affective valence, which is really this hedonistic response to a particular stimulus. Pain or pleasure, is a positive affective valence or a negative affective valence. I like this or I dislike this. And from that association, we can implement a bunch of different things. The values of the agent, we can value these different situations. And we can use this, we talked a little bit about this, about how it could be used in action selection to motivate some particular action over another action because it has more value. And then also, it can modulate learning, meaning content that has some kind of affective valence, or later on we'll talk about incentive salience, which is sort of a flip side of the same thing. That content will become more activated in terms of the base level activation, for example, might be pumped up a little more, or base level incentive salience might be pumped up a little more if you have these different feelings associated with it. There's, just from a terminology standpoint, emotions and feelings. Emotions are just feelings about something. So I might love something or someone. I might feel shame about some particular thing. That's different from hunger, where I'm not hungry about something, I'm just hungry. And so hunger is a feeling, emotions are directed towards something, and they've got associated content. One thing related to how these different feelings will modulate learning, this affect or affective valence, more of it is good up until a certain point. And so there's this Yerkes-Dodson law that specifies this inverted U-curve that pretty much says, okay, well, up to a certain point, more effect is good. And this is sort of the happy spot where we're going to have the optimal strengthening of these different associations. After a certain point, though, the additional affect actually becomes detrimental to the learning process until it can really become negative as you go further and further. The next conceptual commitment is related to comprehensive decay. So all activations in live decay, that might be base level activations, current activations, also other parameters like the base level incentive saliences and current incentive saliences. We usually consider this decay rate as being somehow a sigmoidal kind of curve, where there's this precipitous drop that then levels off, and the details of the actual slope can change however you want to. You can change the function however you want to. But usually there's this kind of a precipitous drop and then slowing down. One of the things this supports is, because of profligacy in learning, we're learning all the time, we're getting all these new representations. We kind of need to prune some of them every once in a while if they become less relevant to the agent. So once decay has had its fun with one of our representations where it gets low enough, then these different modules will prune the representations out, and that supports computational tractability. So perceptual learning, as I said before, instructionalist and selectionist learning, that's kind of how you can divide up all these different ideas. So instructionalist learning is related to new concept representations or new associations between concepts. Selectionist learning is updates to these different parameters like base level activation and base level incentive salience. And this base level incentive salience update, which I'm not going to go into detail about this, but basically you have an event that gets associated with a particular feeling node that has effective valence, and that will result in a bump up if it comes to consciousness. Okay, so learning a new perceptual symbol. So I'm distinguishing, I'll explain this in a little more detail, but perceptual symbol from concept. And this is something that leans on Barceló, Lawrence Barceló's work on perceptual symbol systems. So imagine a scenario where from the environment we see a car. We get that sensory information from the car, encode modality-specific representations. That goes over to the current situational model over here. And then we have a structure building code that builds a blank node that is attached to it. And this is basically something to hang off our information about this new experience that we had. We don't know what it is, but we need something to serve as that skeleton for it to hang off of. So the structure building code that builds a link between this newly created blank node and that content. This content cues the long.
This is the first time you're seeing a car, or not?
Yeah, so I should explain this in a sec. Yeah, exactly. This is the very first time I've seen a car, right? So this queuing process is going over to a perceptual associative memory that doesn't have any concept of a car yet, right? So what happens is, what comes back, you get something back because there's some similarity between things, some things that are recognized. So you might recognize, ooh, red, or ooh, shiny. And those features might come back from Pam, along with maybe my agent really loves shiny cars, and so you have some kind of a positive, feeling node that comes back. These different features and the feeling nodes then get associated, you might not have seen that update, get associated up here with our blank node. New link is created by the structure building codelet. We have an attention codelet that, ooh, loves cars. So it sees the car and it says, okay, well, I want to see if I can bring this to consciousness because I really think cars are important. So a coalition is built from that representation, competes, assuming that it actually does win the global broadcast, being that's somehow the most salient thing to the agent. Then it goes back over, is received by Pam, and then, bam, we've got this little car representation now in our conceptual space, so that if I see this same car again in the future, then I can get that coming back over to the current situational model. It's a perceptual symbol because it's a symbol that refers to something. It refers to the sensory event. Now, conceptual learning itself is really hard, though, because you're going to have tons of these perceptual symbols that are going to be created before all this stuff coalesces into some generalized concept. So we can see how this part of it happens in LIDA. We have feature extraction that's taking at the most relevant parts of this structure. We see how it can get stored back in and recognized later on. The generalization process, though, that's sort of ongoing work, trying to figure out how that's going to work. So we believe it's going to involve structure building codelets and probably some form of unsupervised learning. We've talked about using generative models, maybe learning generative models that would allow us to do something like Barceló simulators. But that's still sort of an open topic of how a generalized concept is learned. So selectionist learning and perceptual learning. Base level activation, in PAM, base level activation has different interpretations based upon the context. But in PAM, what it's really talking about is the relative frequency of concepts. So, for example, imagine that you're hearing the sound of hooves on the ground, and you don't see what's actually causing that sound of hooves. What would happen is whatever you're exposed to the most, whether it be zebras or horses or unicorns, you're naturally going to think of that thing first. So the base level activation quantifies this relative frequency, and the more experiences we have with a particular concept, we increase the base level activation to say, oh, this is something that happens more often, therefore with an unknown cause, this is probably the culprit. So updates to the base level activation. This is going to be very similar to what we just saw a second ago, with a few exceptions. So here we're talking about horses. So we experience a horse. We have this selective feature extraction from the horse to build a modality-specific representation that goes over into the workspace, becomes potentially some multimodal scene related to the horse. This thing is attached to a blank node because it's that one experience. That goes over to Pam, and in this case, we already know about horses. So we cue the concept of a horse. That comes back, goes into the current situational model where our attention codelet grabs the horse, goes over to the global workspace as a coalition. It competes in the global workspace, wins the global broadcast, comes back over to Pam. Again, we already had the horse concept. And then this thing gets jazzed up a little bit. The base level activation gets increased. Procedural learning. Again, selectionist flavor and instructionalist flavor. Instructionalist flavor, we get new schemes, which this is just a reminder of what that is, and potentially complex actions. So again, that really amounts to creating new schemes, but those schemes can combine multiple primitive actions into a more complex action. From the selectionist perspective, the base level activation we talked about is really how likely is it that when I'm in this context, in this particular state, and I take this action, that I'll get the result that I want, that I'll get my 7-layer burrito. So that's either set as a reliability parameter or a likelihood parameter. And updates to that is how selectionist learning would proceed for procedural learning. So I'm going to go through this. So it all starts off with the global workspace and some conscious content from the broadcast. We get some schemes that are activated from that conscious broadcast. They become candidate behaviors, which are sent over to action selection. Action selection then chooses one of these as a selected behavior. The selected behavior then goes to 2 different places. Goes to attentional memory, where it creates that expectation code that we talked about earlier, that will eventually start monitoring for the expected results. It also goes over to procedural memory, where it goes along with a set of recently selected behaviors that are saved there. Now imagine that in our environment, we start getting some new stimuli coming in. That stimuli then commingles with our current situational model in the preconscious workspace. And let's say that we just had this one representation come in that corresponds to our 7-layer burrito. So our expectation code says, ooh, 7-layer burrito. And it grabs that 7-layer burrito representation, brings it over to the global workspace as a coalition. If that burrito then is able to get the conscious broadcast, if it wins the competition in the global workspace, goes back to procedural memory, and because we have the recently selected behaviors, we can compare that content. If the result matches one of them, then we update the scheme that corresponded to that particular behavior. And this is actually the last slide, so I'm getting nervous. Attentional learning. So attentional learning, again, you can divide it up into selectionist learning and instructionalist learning. For selectionist learning, what we're talking about, again, we call it base level activation. This is sort of a ubiquitous parameter that we have in LIDA. In this case, what it's really talking about is the usefulness of our attention codelet. How good is this attention codelet bringing things or suggesting particular content that will then eventually win the competition of the global workspace? So you can imagine this group of attention codelets all saying, this is what's important, or relevant, or I like cars, here's a car. When the global workspace figures out which one of those different things wins, what happens is the coalition is broadcast back over to the attentional memory module, along with all the other modules. And there's an association between the content and the attention codelet that brought that content into the workspace. So when the attentional memory module sees, oh, okay, well this content was advocated for by this guy up here, we'll say, let's increase his base level activation a little bit because he did a good job of bringing something to consciousness. The other form is instructionalist learning, where new attention codelets are made. The way this works, I have to describe the default detention code a little bit. The default detention code doesn't have a specific concern. It's not, it's not cars or horses that really, jazzes up this guy. What he likes is just whatever structure in the current situational model happens to have the most total activation and total incentive salience. Given those things, it just says, okay, well, this is the one, this structure here has the most activation, most incentive salience. I'm going to suggest this guy, and if it goes into a coalition that wins the global broadcast, then the attentional memory module says, oh, okay, well, this is the default attention codelet that did this. We're going to spawn a brand new specific concern attention codelet that cares about the most activated section of that, that coalition, the representations in there that had the most activation. And then that becomes the concern of this attention codelet, and then it begins to monitor for that concern in the future and advocate for it. So that is the end of my presentation. Any questions? I know I had to go through really fast, and it's complicated stuff, but fire away.
Well, that's a good question. How do you go about testing them to see, you test it component by component, or the system as a whole, and compare it to other models, or what is your, empirical analytical approach?
So what, I'm just going to take a stab at this and you can jump in. So what usually happens is we build agents that target some particular need, like we want to model the attentional blink, for example, or we want to model this particular kind of thing. We usually will build a targeted agent for that particular thing. So that's one way that we do it. Also, just conceptually walking through, does it make sense at all? Does it hold muster when we think through this whole thing? And if something just doesn't make any sense, we'll say, okay, well, that's not going to work as a possible solution. But I personally believe that the engineering aspect of building it and seeing what happens, I think that's the best way to do it if you can from an end-to-end process.
But seeing is that if it makes sense,
That's the first step.
that what that means is comparing it to what's known from the psychology, from the neuroscience. Does it contradict some experiment? Or does it help to explain some experiment? That's what we really want to do, and that's how we, and the engineering side. It's a Janus thing with the science side and an engineering side.
So if I could just ask one follow-up. You probably found this experiment, this happened in the past, Stan, or possibly you, where you said, I was thinking it happened this way all along, but after looking at the results and thinking through, I was wrong. Do you have an example of that occurring?
Well, the attentional blink, for example, we tried to get that to work, and we couldn't explain the data. Yeah. I mean, people have been working on attentional blinks for forever. There's dozens of experiments, and we couldn't explain the data. Turns out what we had to do is to look at the neuroscience and find out what's it called, the locus coeruleus. And what it says is that you get a whole, every time you get a very strong attention codelet, a very bright light or a loud noise or something that's extremely important, whatever. Every time that happens, then the whole set of them needs a
refractory
period. That's what I was thinking of. Yeah. And we had to build that into the model because it wasn't there before. Without it, we couldn't.
So that's adding a component in.
It's adding a piece, not a component.
Well, it's adding
We're changing how we,
parameter.
with a parameter,
Yeah.
adding a parameter.
So did you ever come up with a component that you said, this isn't necessary? you don't
Yeah.
need this component.
We got some things from,
Look at all the codelets that we used to have, that we, like behavior codelets, everything else, we've definitely trimmed down the number of
but
codelets.
that wasn't what, that was more a terminology thing, because Bernie Barr's in his